The Quiet Life of Charles Dickens, a calm literary biography. Part 1. He died famous, beloved, and exhausted at 58. Charles Dickens gave the world unforgettable characters and stories that still echo today. But the man behind the pages lived a life far more complicated than the tidy endings he wrote for his novels. Born in Portsmouth in 1812, Charles John Huffam Dickens entered a world on the edge of transformation. Britain was industrialising rapidly, cities swelling with workers, and the gap between rich and poor widening into a chasm that would define his entire literary career. His father, John Dickens, worked as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office. Respectable enough on paper, but John had a fatal flaw. He spent money he didn't have. Charles's early childhood wasn't miserable, not yet. The family moved frequently, bouncing between naval towns, and young Charles absorbed everything. Faces, voices, the rhythm of speech, the small cruelties and kindnesses people showed each other. He read voraciously, devouring adventure tales and novels that transported him far from cramped rented rooms. Then everything collapsed. In 1824, when Charles was 12, his father's debts finally caught up with him. John Dickens was arrested and sent to Marshalsea debtors' prison. The family, following the custom of the time, moved into the prison with him. Except Charles. He was sent to work at Warren's blacking factory, pasting labels onto pots of shoe polish for 10 hours a day. This wasn't a character-building summer job. It was humiliation, abandonment, the kind of wound that never fully heals. Charles stood at a workbench in a rat-infested warehouse near the Thames, a bright boy with literary dreams, reduced to manual labour alongside rough children who mocked his sensitivity. He felt the shame physically, a burning that stayed with him for decades. He never forgot it, and he never quite forgave his mother for suggesting he continue working, even after his father's release. Eventually his father's fortunes shifted slightly. An inheritance cleared the debts, and Charles was pulled from the factory and sent back to school. But something had changed inside him. He understood now that security was an illusion, that respectability could vanish overnight, that society cared nothing for the vulnerable. These weren't abstract lessons, they were scars. By 15, Charles was working as a law clerk, observing the legal system's cold machinery up close. He hated it. The pomposity, the indifference, the way justice bent toward money. But he watched, listened, and filed away details that would later populate Bleak House and other works skewering institutional cruelty. Then he discovered shorthand. Teaching himself this complex system of rapid notation, Charles became a freelance court reporter and eventually a parliamentary journalist. He was good, fast, accurate, and ambitious. He sat in the press gallery of the House of Commons, transcribing debates, watching politicians perform for crowds and accomplish little. The experience left him permanently sceptical of grand promises and empty rhetoric, but journalism gave him something else, a voice. In 1833 he submitted a sketch to a magazine. It was published. No payment, just the thrill of seeing his words in print. He wrote more, sharpening his observations of London life, developing the humorous, compassionate, satirical style that would become his signature. These weren't stories yet, just sketches, small portraits of city characters, street scenes, the oddities of urban existence. Published under the pen name Boz, they caught attention. Readers enjoyed the wit, the warmth, the sense that someone was actually paying attention to ordinary people. Then came the breakthrough. In 1836, a publisher approached him with an unusual proposal. They wanted someone to write text to accompany a series of humorous illustrations about a fictional club of amateur sportsmen. The original writer had dropped out. Would Charles be interested? He was 24 years old. What emerged was the Pickwick Papers, published in monthly instalments starting in March 1836. The first few episodes sold modestly, but something was building. Readers began waiting for the next instalment, discussing the characters, laughing at the misadventures of Mr. Pickwick and his companions. By the end of the serial run, Dickens was famous. This was new. Serialized fiction had existed before, but never with this level of cultural penetration. People from every social class read Pickwick. They named their children after the characters, their pets, their businesses. Dickens had tapped into something deep, a hunger for stories that felt alive, that mingled humour with heart, that treated working people as fully human. He married Catherine Hogarth in 1836, the same year Pickwick began. She was the daughter of his editor, quiet and conventional, where Charles was energetic and restless. They would have 10 children together over the years, and the marriage would slowly, painfully unravel. But in those early days, Charles was simply a young man whose life had suddenly, unexpectedly opened wide. Success didn't slow him down, it accelerated him. While still writing Pickwick, he began Oliver Twist, published in serial form starting in 1837. This wasn't light-hearted comedy. This was the story of a workhouse orphan navigating London's criminal underworld, a direct confrontation with the cruelty Charles had witnessed and experienced. Oliver Twist shocked readers. It was darker, angrier, more political than Pickwick. Dickens wasn't just entertaining anymore, he was accusing. The workhouse system, child exploitation, the casual brutality of poverty, all of it laid bare in monthly installments that readers devoured, and they kept coming back. What's striking isn't just that Dickens wrote these novels, it's that he wrote them simultaneously, juggling multiple serialized stories, editing a magazine, maintaining a furious social schedule and raising a growing family. His energy seemed limitless, his output superhuman, but the pace came at a cost, one that wouldn't become fully apparent for years. By his late 20s, Charles Dickens had transformed from a struggling journalist into Britain's most popular living author. His characters, Pickwick, Oliver, Fagin, the Artful Dodger, had become part of the cultural vocabulary. He'd proven that fiction could be both wildly entertaining and socially conscious, that stories could make people laugh and think and feel outrage all at once. He'd also discovered something about himself. He needed the applause. The adulation wasn't just pleasant, it was essential. Writing alone in a room wasn't enough. He craved the immediate response of an audience, the validation that came from seeing his impact in real time. This hunger would shape everything that followed. The public readings, the theatrical productions, the relentless touring, even as his health declined. Dickens didn't just write stories. He performed them, lived inside them, used them to process his own unresolved pain while connecting with millions who saw their own struggles reflected in his pages. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In these early years of sudden fame, Charles was still learning what it meant to be Charles Dickens. The workhouse boy had become a literary celebrity, but the wound from Warren's blacking factory still ached beneath the success. He would spend the rest of his life writing around that wound, circling it, transforming it into art that outlived him by centuries. And the next chapter of his story would take him even deeper into the darkness he'd survived, with a novel about a city, a revolution, and the ghosts that haunt us all. By 1837, Dickens had become a literary phenomenon, but he wasn't satisfied with just writing. He wanted control. He wanted to shape the entire reading experience, from the story itself to how it reached the public. So he did something audacious. He became an editor. He took over a new monthly magazine called Bentley's Miscellany, which gave him a platform to publish his own work while discovering new writers. It was here that Oliver Twist unfolded in installments, alongside essays, reviews, and serialized stories by other authors. Dickens was everywhere at once, writer and curator, storyteller and tastemaker. But the workload was crushing. He was writing 2 novels simultaneously, editing a magazine, attending endless social functions, and trying to be a husband and father. His letters from this period reveal a man stretched dangerously thin, complaining of exhaustion, insomnia, and constant deadlines that felt like nooses tightening around his neck. Still, he kept pushing. Because stopping meant confronting something he couldn't yet face, the boy he'd been, the shame that still lived inside him, the fear that if he slowed down, people might see through the performance. In 1838, Dickens published Nicholas Nickleby, another sprawling social novel that attacked the brutal Yorkshire boarding schools where unwanted children were essentially warehoused. He'd actually travelled north to research these schools, visiting one particularly notorious institution run by a sadistic headmaster. That man became the basis for Wackford Squeers, one of Dickens's most memorably vile villains. Nickleby was another massive success. Readers lined up at newsstands on publication day, eager for the next instalment. Dickens had perfected the art of the cliffhanger, ending each monthly part at precisely the moment that made waiting unbearable. But success brought complications. Publishers wanted to lock him into contracts. Readers expected a new masterpiece every year. His family kept growing, and with it, his expenses. The more he earned, the more he spent, and the more he needed to earn. It was a treadmill he'd never escape. In 1841, Dickens published The Old Curiosity Shop, and something shifted. The novel centred on little Nell, a pure-hearted child who dies at the end, and readers lost their minds. Grown men wept openly. Crowds mobbed Dickens, demanding to know if Nell would survive. When she didn't, the public mourning was unlike anything literature had seen. Dickens had discovered he could make people feel deeply and collectively. That power intoxicated him, but it also trapped him. Audiences now expected a certain emotional manipulation, a guaranteed catharsis. He'd become a master puppeteer, but the strings ran both ways. By his early 30s, Charles Dickens was wealthy, famous, and exhausted. He'd written 6 major novels in 5 years. He'd become a cultural institution, yet something gnawed at him. America. The United States represented everything Dickens believed in: democracy, social mobility, the rejection of hereditary privilege. He'd never visited, but he'd idealized it from afar, imagining a society built on merit rather than birth. So in 1842 he sailed to America for a grand tour, expecting to find a nation of Pickwicks. What he found instead was a rude awakening. Americans adored Dickens. They turned out by the thousands to see him, mobbing his hotel, stealing locks of his hair, even cutting pieces from his coat. But they also pirated his books shamelessly. American publishers reprinted his novels without permission or payment, making fortunes while Dickens saw nothing. When he complained about this theft, the American press turned on him viciously. He was shocked by the hypocrisy. This democratic paradise he'd imagined was built partly on stolen intellectual property. Worse, it was a slave nation. Dickens had opposed slavery his entire life, and seeing it firsthand in the American South filled him with disgust. He returned to England disillusioned and angry, and immediately wrote American Notes, a travel book that pulled no punches. Americans were furious. How dare this British writer criticise their country? The backlash was fierce, but Dickens didn't care. He followed up with Martin Chuzzlewit, a novel that savaged American culture even more brutally. The book was meant as punishment, a literary revenge, but it backfired commercially. British readers were growing tired of Dickens's moralising, and American readers boycotted him entirely. For the first time in his career, a Dickens novel struggled. This terrified him. His financial situation was precarious despite his fame. He had a large household, mounting debts, and a lifestyle he couldn't afford to downgrade. A commercial failure meant catastrophe. So in 1843, desperate to prove himself again, Dickens wrote something different. Something shorter, faster, more focused. He wrote it in 6 weeks, pouring everything he had into a story about a miser, transformed by ghosts on Christmas Eve. He called it A Christmas Carol. The book wasn't just successful, it redefined Christmas itself. Dickens took a minor holiday and transformed it into the sentimental, family-centred celebration we know today. Suddenly, Christmas meant generosity, redemption, second chances. It meant Tiny Tim and Scrooge and ghosts bearing warnings. But here's the irony. Dickens made almost nothing from it. He'd invested heavily in the book's production, insisting on expensive bindings and illustrations. When it sold out immediately, he expected a windfall. Instead, after costs, he earned barely enough to cover his debts. Once again, success had slipped through his fingers. He'd created something immortal and walked away broke. Charles Dickens, now in his 30s, found himself caught between 2 contradictory impulses. He wanted financial security, yet he couldn't stop spending. He craved artistic freedom, yet he'd become dependent on the very public he sometimes resented. His personal life was no simpler. His marriage to Catherine had produced 10 children, but little joy. She was kind, patient, and utterly unable to keep up with him. He was restless, mercurial, consumed by work. The gap between them widened every year. By the late 1840s, Dickens had hit his stride again. Dombey and Son was a massive success, followed by David Copperfield, his most autobiographical novel. In it, he finally confronted his childhood trauma, disguised as fiction. David's suffering mirrored his own: poverty, abandonment, humiliation. Writing it was cathartic, but it didn't heal him. The wounds were too deep. What it did do was cement his reputation as the greatest living English novelist. But greatness brought pressure. Every new book was expected to outdo the last. Critics watched for any sign of decline. Readers wanted more sentiment, more drama, more tears. Dickens delivered, but at a cost. He was writing constantly, editing a magazine, managing a household and starting to feel the weight of it all. Then came Bleak House, a sprawling masterpiece that attacked the British legal system with surgical precision. It was dark, complex, and brilliant, but it also revealed something troubling. Dickens was growing angrier. His early optimism was fading. He no longer believed society could reform itself through kindness alone. He was beginning to see the world as fundamentally broken, and his novels reflected that shift. Hard Times followed, a bleak industrial nightmare. Little Dorrit dissected the prison system and financial corruption. These weren't feel-good stories, they were indictments. By the mid-1850s, Dickens was suffocating. His marriage was a hollow shell, his energy was fraying. He needed escape, and he found it in the theatre. He'd always loved performing, and now he began staging elaborate amateur productions, throwing himself into acting with manic intensity. It was during one of these productions that he met Ellen Ternan, a young actress barely out of her teens. She was everything Catherine wasn't: lively, sharp, attentive. Dickens fell hard. What happened next was one of the great scandals of Victorian England, though it was carefully hidden at the time. Dickens separated from his wife in 1858, a shocking move for a man who'd built his reputation on family values. He issued a public statement denying any affair, but the whispers persisted. Ellen became his secret companion, hidden away in rented houses supported by his money, invisible to the public. Dickens maintained the facade of respectability, but privately he was living a double life. This hypocrisy haunted him. He preached morality in his novels while concealing his own moral compromises. He championed the downtrodden while treating his wife with cold cruelty. He was a man at war with himself, and that war bled into his work. His later novels grew darker, more cynical. A Tale of Two Cities explored revolution and violence. Great Expectations questioned whether self-improvement was even possible. Dickens was no longer the cheerful optimist of Pickwick. He was something harder, sharper, more conflicted. Yet even as his private life unravelled, his public fame soared. In 1858 he began giving public readings of his work, performing excerpts from his novels to packed theatres. These weren't simple recitations. They were full theatrical performances. Dickens embodied his characters, shifting voices, gestures, expressions. Audiences were spellbound. He became the first celebrity author in the modern sense, touring Britain and America, earning vast sums. But the readings drained him. He poured everything into them, night after night, until his health began to fail. Doctors warned him to slow down. His family begged him to rest. But Dickens couldn't stop. The readings gave him something he'd craved his entire life: control. On stage, he wasn't dependent on publishers or critics. He was the sole creator of the experience. The applause was immediate, the connection visceral. It was addictive. By the late 1860s, Dickens was visibly deteriorating. His face was gaunt, his energy erratic. He suffered from fainting spells and strange numbness in his limbs. Yet he continued touring, driven by financial need and something deeper, a fear of irrelevance. He was terrified of being forgotten, of slipping into obscurity. So he pushed harder, despite the cost. His final completed novel, Our Mutual Friend, appeared in 1865. It was a strange, ambitious book, darker and more experimental than anything he'd written before. Critics were divided. Some hailed it as a masterpiece. Others found it confusing and overwritten. Dickens didn't care. He was already working on something new, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. A murder mystery unlike anything he'd attempted, but he never finished it. On June 8, 1870, after a long day of writing, Dickens collapsed at his home. He died the next day at age 58, his final novel incomplete. The ending of Edwin Drood remains one of literature's great mysteries. No one knows who the killer was, or how Dickens planned to resolve the story. It's fitting, in a way. His life ended mid-sentence, unresolved, still reaching for something just out of grasp. Charles Dickens left behind 15 novels, countless stories, and a legacy that reshaped English literature. He gave voice to the voiceless, humanized the poor, and made readers care about people they'd never meet. But he also left behind contradictions. A champion of family who abandoned his wife, a critic of greed who obsessed over money, a man who preached compassion while struggling to forgive his own past. He was complicated, flawed, and undeniably human, and maybe that's why his work endures. Because beneath all the sentiment and melodrama, Dickens understood something fundamental. We're all broken, all struggling, all trying to be better than we are. His characters weren't perfect. Neither was he. But they tried, and in the trying, they became unforgettable. He died leaving more questions than answers, not just about Edwin Drood's unfinished plot, but about himself. The boy who pasted labels in a blacking factory became the voice of Victorian England, yet never escaped that warehouse. Every novel was an attempt to rewrite his childhood, to give fictional orphans the happy endings he never quite achieved. Dickens transformed how we think about Christmas, poverty, childhood, and justice. He made readers weep for characters who existed only on paper. He turned serialized fiction into a cultural event, proving stories could unite people across class divides. His influence echoes in every novel that dares to mix social criticism with entertainment. Every writer who believes fiction can change minds. But his greatest achievement might be simpler. He made people care. About chimney sweeps and debtors, about crippled children and exploited workers, about all the invisible souls ground down by indifferent systems. He forced Victorian England to see its own cruelty reflected back in monthly instalments they couldn't stop reading. The contradictions never resolved. The workhouse boy who became wealthy but died in debt. The moralist who kept a secret mistress. The exhausted performer who couldn't leave the stage. Charles Dickens lived multiple lives simultaneously, and none of them quite fit together. Perhaps that's why he still matters, not despite his flaws, but because of them. He showed us that broken people can create beauty, that wounded children can grow into artists, that the damage we carry doesn't have to define us completely. His characters survived because he survived, and in their survival, millions of readers found permission to keep going through their own darkness. The novels remain. The boy in the factory lives forever in their pages, transformed into something larger than pain. That's the quiet miracle of Charles Dickens. He turned his suffering into stories that outlasted the suffering itself.